It was now 2:30 a.m., day one of the invasion. As the suppression of enemy air defense operations had been a complete success by this point, as originally all of the Trojan shock elements of the 77th Group Army, having had left their nearby CCP regime properties miles away before moving into the area to set up their artillery in order to carry out fire missions, including their entire Group Army 77th Artillery Brigade with its A300 long-range heavy rocket artillery systems, which were actually, in fact, the longest range in the world with an approximately 187-mile range, and also an enormous sized rocket at 300 millimeters per rocket, in addition to their PHL-11 systems, which were essentially a large upgrade in terms of the cab and chassis being up-armored and also additional equipment, which was a large upgrade from the original PHL-81, which were a grad-like truck-based system, were setting up, and also the PLL-66 152 millimeter howitzer battalions, of which there were two, in addition to the PLL-01 155 millimeter towed howitzer battalions, of which there were also two. So there were four howitzer battalions, two rocket battalions of the 122 millimeter PHL-11s, and one A300 system, which was firing further to the south and hitting targets on the Sheppard Air Base merely moments ago. The PHL-11s launched a savage 122 millimeter rocket barrage on the 75th Field Artillery Brigade, which broke up the units and caused massive retreating, as, again, in the initiation of all the hostilities of the entire invasion, the tandem anti-satellite strike and cyber strike nullified most of America's eyes and ears, with local electronic warfare assets handling all of the redundant systems, such as radios, and also portable radar systems, such as those of the Patriot batteries, comprising the battalions that were not necessarily dependent upon satellite or internet, and therefore were not affected by the anti-sat strikes or the cyber attack, and therefore were handled by electronic warfare assets like the EW assets on these two H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft out of the whole 8 aircraft squadron, these two being equipped with the KG-600 electromagnetic jamming pods, which could pinpoint the origins of signals and radars and jam them as they operated in the area. As this was unfolding, again, as units were broken up by these savage rocket strikes as well as howitzer strikes from the PLL-66 152 millimeter howitzers and PLL-01 155 millimeter strikes occurring all throughout the area, the 77th Combat Engineering Brigade and its subordinate comprising combat battalions had launched a large operation to destroy the 75th Field Artillery Brigade, of which they had already mostly succeeded in doing, although many of these now broken up and fleeing units were scattered about the area and were now being engaged in smaller isolated pockets. Some of them did manage to flee a bit further away and attempted to regroup and carry out local counterattacks, which were complete failures, as again, these were now mixed units mixing together from the former battalions and having to, on an ad hoc basis, coordinate their efforts and try to maintain communications, having to concentrate their forces in order to keep them within earshot to be able to effectively communicate, as their radios were now inoperable due to the KG-600 jamming electronic warfare assets aboard these two specific H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft, and were therefore completely at the mercy of the invading forces. A lone Combat Engineer Combat Battalion had attacked and seized control over the southwest corner airfield, as the airfields were considered as vital infrastructure for later use during the occupation that was to come after the invasion phase had ended and victory was achieved. They, having had destroyed most of the 3rd of the 13th here, while the rocket strikes, CH-901A loitering munition strikes, and even close air support strikes from their fighter aircraft, which primarily were operating to ensure control of the airspace with combat air patrols, air superiority operations. They were equipped with a small amount of ground attack munitions, but were mostly equipped with air-to-air munitions for their role as a fighter. But they could, at the very least, conduct some very localized air support for the ground troops, as in close air support operations. Although primarily the close air support, as well as tactical ground attack strikes that were according to the original battle plan as ascertained intelligence on specific key targets on the installation, was essentially used to pinpoint specific targets for destruction, pre-designated before the invasion. Although close air support was also given by these aircraft, being this Su-35 strike aircraft squadron in addition to this Su-34 strike aircraft squadron of the Russian VVS, in addition to the PLAAF fighter squadron of J-11 fighters and their heavy strategic bomber squadron of H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft. Early on in the operation, as the 77th Support Brigade of the PLA 77th Group Army moved into the area from CCP regime properties, bringing along ample supplies in their supply trucks with them, they established a temporary bivouac area from which they could send small platoon-sized elements out to continually feed the combat units with fuel, MREs, as in their food, and their water, as well as ammunition to allow these units to stay highly mobile during this specific battle. As the clock was now beyond 2:30 a.m. or 2.5 hours into the invasion, and the first special operations companies of the 4 battalions being transported by helicopter were beginning to be flown in first to secure the Henry Army Airfield, which the area had been softened up by tactical ballistic missile strikes, in addition to airstrikes and also cruise missile strikes after 2 a.m. when the first volleys or salvos of YJ-18C or Club K container-based cruise missiles built by China and Russia respectively began to fire at pre-designated targets throughout the installation, among many other areas throughout the nation. But local container-based cruise missiles in the North Texas, Southern Oklahoma area selected multiple targets throughout the installation to hit in particular, allowing for the rapid air assault operation of these companies of this one of 2 battalions that would ultimately establish a security perimeter after rapidly seizing the Henry Army Airfield, were beginning to drop off their first troops or their first companies, as each of these Z-20 transport helicopters could transport a squad per aircraft, and there were 32 of these in each transport helicopter battalion, making a total of 64 out of the entire 77th Aviation Brigade's 2 transport helicopter battalions combined. They were able to bring in the vast majority of the first of 2 battalions that were to be dropped off in the Henry Army Airfield, conducting a quick lightning strike air assault operation to clear the area of any armed American resistance, as the door gunners on the helicopters could fire down at any combat forces operating on the Henry Army Airfield in conjunction with dropping off their troops to do the rest of the dirty work of clearing the area, before flying rapidly south again to pick up the rest of the 4 battalions total that were to be transported by air. The rest of the Special Operations Brigade of the 77th Group Army was to come up by vehicle up I-44 from the Wichita Falls Sheppard Air Base area. Its Heavy Special Weapons Battalion, in addition to two other battalions being transported by the Headquarters Battalion, whose main responsibility as the Headquarters Battalion was to operate all the ground vehicles of the entire brigade. As this was a battalion-sized element consisting of not just the administrative and command elements, but also the rest of it being primarily comprised of drivers for the various vehicles. The gunner positions on the vehicles would, of course, be taken by the special operators that were picked up in their battalions in these vehicles, as each vehicle could carry a squad of them. And they drove these 3 different battalions, 2 of regular special operator combat troops, and 1 of their heavy special weapons battalion into the area. Although they would be arriving around 3 a.m., the first battalions, the first 2 out of 4 that were to be airlifted into the area by the 2 transport helicopter battalions of the 77th Aviation Brigade, were to first cover the Henry Army Airfield, secure it, capture it, secure it, and establish a security perimeter around it, before the other 2 battalions would be flown in and dropped off to maintain control over the Lawton Fort Sill Regional Airport, as this was another vital airstrip worth controlling, another local airport, in addition to the Army airfields. And therefore, the forces coming up by road of the rest of the brigade of the special operators would hold this part of the area here, consisting of the airport and also just south of the city itself, to maintain control over the I-44 corridor south of the city, in order to allow for even more reinforcements from the 40th and 150th Mountain Combined Arms Brigades to move north, although by the time they would arrive to the battle as reinforcements, the battle will have concluded and been over with. As all of the heavy fighting occurring between the 75th Field Artillery Brigade and the 77th Combat Engineers, in addition to the 1st Armored Battalion's Brigade Artillery, Divisional Artillery Brigade, which was right here fighting this single Combat Engineer Battalion, was unfolding, as these 2 brigades were conducting a large dual brigade-sized training mission together. They had received heavy air support from their own strategic bomber aircraft, their own fighter aircraft, using their limited air-to-ground munitions, as again, they were mostly equipped with air-to-air munitions in their role as fighters, but could supply some close air support operations, but mostly it was up to the Su-35 and Su-34 squadrons for the close air support role. They heavily pounded many of these formations into complete oblivion with the combination of enormous artillery strikes from rocket and howitzer artillery into the area, in addition to heavy strategic bomber aircraft and the fighter aircraft doing their limited close air support operations, with also the Su-35 squadron operating in this area here, as well as the Su-34s having it softened up the Henry Army Airfield, in addition to the tactical ballistic missile and cruise missile strikes, in order for the air assault operation to be flawlessly carried out by the initially arriving companies of 1 of 2 battalions set to operate the area of the 77th PLA Group Army 77th Special Operations Brigade. As all of that was now unfolding simultaneously, this lone Mechanized Infantry Battalion of the 181st Combined Arms Brigade, having had destroyed the 5th of the 5th ADA Battalion of the 31st ADA Brigade, was now moving to cut off escape to the north out of the post. as the headquarters of Headquarters Battalion of the 428th Brigade, as elements of skeleton crew, elements of the 434th and 428th, which didn't deploy to the south, was still on the installation, were operating in this area of the northwestern corner of the installation. The 2nd of the 2nd Battalion was an M119A3 battalion primarily, consisting of only 2 firing batteries, its Alpha and Bravo batteries, which had the towed M119A3 105mm howitzers, and this was a training element again, but they had these firing batteries of these howitzers, as well as elements from the 1st of the 30th who were operating M109A6 Paladins, again, another training battalion with a few firing batteries with their headquarters of Headquarters Battery, were operating in this area here. As this was unfolding, one of the H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft and another, these two being equipped with their KG-600 jamming pods, were circling the area, and now that the ISR assets and the evolving battlefield situation being processed by artificial intelligence literally by the millisecond, updating commanders by the second on all the fluid battlefield conditions as the battlefield ebbed and flowed, the intelligence was fed to the PLA-AF aircraft that there were moving forces in this area responding to the unfolding battle, as well as a lot of trainees in the area, including even the schoolhouse element of the 2nd of the 6th Air Defense Artillery Regiment, part of the training forces of this TRADOC post, which was a schoolhouse unit for training in air defense artillery systems. They were all in this general area in the northwest corner of the installation. They were being hit at this point by artillery strikes, in addition to now the heavy strategic bomber aircraft circling and moving in for the proverbial kill, as the Armored Bttn and another Mechanized Infantry battalion of the 181st Combined Arms Brigade, having had surrounded and destroyed and also parried a counterattack by foot-based troops that abandoned their equipment and vehicles as artillery began striking and destroying them, in addition to missiles of the tactical ballistic missile and cruise missile varieties, they had circled around attempting to relieve their encircled brethren of their unit, being the 4th of the 3rd and their headquarters of Headquarters Battery, which was their command elements of the whole brigade, and had been parried and destroyed before these 2 battalions had moved in after assisting in completing the whole SEAD operation, or suppression of enemy air defenses, to strike the main installation and attack all of these different training elements of the 434th, who left some skeleton crews of their forward deployed battalions in the south at Sheppard, conducting their force security operations there for the airbase, and also the full 428th Field Artillery Brigade, the full entire brigade being in this area, along with trainees that were actually training on some of these howitzers at the time of the invasion having erupted. Going to the local segment of the larger battle map. As this was unfolding, the Armored Battalion moved in with one of its tank companies. It was comprised of 4 tank companies, an anti-tank company, 2 armored infantry companies, and also its headquarters company, sending a tank company of Type 99A main battle tanks, which were potentially the most advanced main battle tank in the world. And they were moving rapidly across the terrain after destroying the 31st Air Defense Artillery Brigade in conjunction with the 181st Combined Arms Brigade's own artillery battalion, as well as the Mechanized Infantry Battalion operating with the Armored Battalion's forces, moving into the area along with loitering munitions, CH-901As having been fired by the dedicated drone sections of the 181st Zone Headquarters Battalion, and were now advancing along with the arriving attack helicopter and armed reconnaissance helicopter battalions of the 77th PLA Group Army 77th Aviation Brigade to support their ground operations, were moving to destroy what essentially was all of these different training units. Many of them, even at this late hour, were conducting training, not just with trainees, but within the batteries comprising these battalions themselves, some of which, in response to the unfolding blasts occurring throughout the installation, as well as having lost all their communications, mounted up in their vehicles, although many others wouldn't have this chance, as whole motor pools were being hit by tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and air attack. In this small picture, there's a CH-901A loitering munition. There's 3 tanks pictured moving in a wedge formation of main battle tanks. These are the Type-99A main battle tanks. And this is a destroyed MRAP, having caught fire among the ammunition stored inside, cooking off, including illumination 40mm grenade rounds, which caught certain items on fire when a tank shell ripped through the side at an angle and blasted out the back and parts of the side of this and threw pieces of the engine block everywhere as well, such as here and here. And it rolled on a dismount that was outside of the MRAP. On the side of it, it rolled on them when the tank shell impacted the area with shrapnel impacting this soldier and blasting off 2 legs and an arm of this guy and impacting this guy, as they were also taking coax machine gun fire and, in some cases, the 12.7mm turret machine gun fire from some of the tank turrets of these powerful main battle tanks, such as here and here. The fighting was extremely intense, as all throughout the invasion such was the case, and these forces, highly unprepared for what struck them, were completely devastated by the combination of all of the ground fire from the armored forces, the artillery forces, even dismounted infantry forces or mechanized mounted up in their IFVs and APCs, in addition to the helicopter-based forces, loitering munitions, and, of course, the tactical ballistic and cruise missile strikes, and also airstrikes. During this fighting here, what was occurring was these motor pools were already being hit by DF-15Bs and DF-21As, as well as the volleys of YJ-18C cruise missiles, or the caliber Club K cruise missiles, which were also a container-based system, which were made by the Russians, as the YJ-18C was a container-based cruise missile system made by the Chinese. They were very similar, and for all intents and purposes might as well have been the same thing, although they were a little bit different as they were from 2 different nations. As the artillery also struck buildings in the area, literally a shell landing on this building at the opening of this map in this picture, and more beyond it, with a tactical ballistic missile strike here, one here, and one here in this motor pool, destroying much of this building, with another one landing on the other side of the building, as this was a massive maintenance building. There was a building here, a smaller building, as well as certain vehicles parked outside of it, which are gone because they're completely under this crater marker, which shows an impact of of a missile, either ballistic or cruise. In this case, these are ballistic. This building is being totally gutted before it's completely destroyed with all of these vehicles, as this heavy strategic H-6K bomber overflies the area, dropping enormous payloads, having released their first payloads further back, leveling these buildings of this motor pool area here, as both fly over the area and eventually swallow up this battery, this single firing battery of training forces of the 1st of the 30th out of the 428th Field Artillery Brigade, trying to move into battle to meet any oncoming threats, as all of this had started early on in the fighting. These forces were well aware by this point of exactly what was going on, having various single dismounted troops or troops on ATVs, such as the Gator ATVs the Army likes to use in these TRADOC posts, running to them and informing them of different occurrences happening throughout the installation, as there was definitely a full 50 minutes by this point since the opening of the fighting at 1:40 a.m. to be able to even do this. As these troops were being informed, as well as hearing the savage barrage of artillery, of airdrop munitions from ground attack aircraft, in addition to the heavy strategic bomber aircraft on the other end of the installation, hitting the 75th and also the visiting and for training Divisional Artillery Brigade of the 1st Armored Division and its subordinate battalions, in addition to all of the rattling of small arms, machine gun fire, tank shells blasting, and more. As the attack helicopters entered the area, they began to fire their laser-guided, very powerful anti-tank missiles, which were AKD-10s, which each Z-10 attack helicopter, this being essentially a company of them right here, could fire 8 of them at a time, as each of their 4 hardpoints could carry a 2-missile rack on each hardpoint, comprising a total of 8 of these missiles. Or they could carry a combination of different other weapons, such as rocket pods, or also a mix and match of HJ-8 or HJ-9 anti-tank missiles, or the AKD, mixed with the other types of weapons, and so on. They had a very potent 25mm chain gun with armor-piercing ammunition, or in some cases, blasting ammunition, like the HE rounds. And some of these helicopters were mixed and matched with different ammunition, but this particular attack helicopter company of Z-10 attack helicopters moving into the area was equipped with AKD laser-guided, or the AKD-10 laser-guided anti-tank missiles, and were having great success against these self-propelled artillery howitzers, especially up here moving into this area, as these were left to the H-6K strategic bomber aircraft rapidly overflying the area, simply smashing these motor pools up here as they had done back here, moving into the area to do the same to this one, in addition with the tactical ballistic missile strikes hitting them. This one already having hit this area here had already destroyed these vehicles immediately surrounding the outer blast radius, as these tactical ballistic missiles produced a large blast radius totaling up to 800 meters, although the most destructive parts were within a 500-meter circle. So they radiated out in terms of the most destructive parts within this inner crater that was roughly 50 meters in diameter, which was a relatively deep crater, which emanated out. And as the further out it got, the less damaging it would be. Like by 800 meters away, it would shatter windows, set off car alarms, do things like that, and do some very minor damage to buildings, while as you got closer to the point of impact, it would be the most destructive there, of course. vehicles were smashed in this part of this motor pool, as well as a smaller building, while this huge maintenance building was already hit and mostly leveled, with this one severely damaged and about to get hit by another strike, which would produce another massive crater here. This one was hit as well. This belonged to the Alpha battery of the 2nd of the 2nd with its towed M119A3 howitzers, which were the 105 millimeter howitzers, and some were destroyed in this missile strike, others in this artillery barrage happening in this part of the motor pool. There were troops training on these at the time, along with the cadre of these batteries, and many of them had fled, while some of the cadre mounted up in other artillery vehicles, as they, of course, had knowledge of both towed and self-propelled artillery pieces, and mounted up in some of the stored fast Vs and self-propelled guns, the M109A6 Paladins, including the FDC vehicles, as well as a fuel truck and M88 armored recovery vehicle and MRAPs, the Max Pro MRAPs, and trucks. They all got into a group along with the M109A6 Paladin batteries, specifically of the 1st of the 30th Battalion, which was of the same brigade, the 428th. And they also had earlier gotten into their vehicles as they were informed of what was going on, as survivors from further away from the west came in and informed them, as well as survivors from other parts of the installation, and they opted to try to go out and meet the threat head-on and potentially fire their copperhead anti-tank rounds, essentially, which was almost like a missile in some ways, at these Chinese main battle tanks, although they would never get the chance, as not only had ample numbers of vehicles been already smashed by this strategic air raid, but they too were about to be smashed. This battery right here belonging to the 1st of the 30th Battalion. With this one here, these vehicles normally used for training being utilized by some of the survivors. They weren't fully crewed, as, again, this was done on a very ad hoc emergency basis, as the missile strikes from cruise and tactical ballistic missiles, CH-901As beginning to enter the area and hit targets as they were set on their AI targeting mode, were beginning to hit part of this battery that was trying to respond, also from the 1st of the 30th, and this one being crewed by survivors of the 2nd of the 2nd, who normally operated their towed howitzers. Again, this is very ad hoc. That must be understood, as these forces were simply responding. They were even grabbing some of the trainees and putting them in these vehicles to crew the turrets, as far as the machine gun mounts and other positions, such as the driver position, to get them to drive these vehicles out, while the experienced personnel of the 2nd of the 2nd would man the commander's position, the vehicle commander position, as well as the gunner position and the number 1 man position, which they were responsible for loading and firing the howitzer, as one would load the shell, the powder, and set the fuses, and the other would operate the lanyard and fire the weapon. These forces, again, were put together on a very ad hoc basis and were driving out in great haste to meet the threat, only by then to be totally smashed by airdrop munitions of these very powerful H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft, in addition to the tactical cruise and ballistic missiles, or the tactical ballistic missile and also cruise missile strikes and artillery strikes, totally leveling many of these motor pools, where there were ample numbers of vehicles and howitzers stocked for training purposes, as well as those belonging to the 2nd of the 2nd's subordinate 2 firing battalions, its Alpha and Bravo battery, I'm sorry, not battalion, but batteries comprising the battalion of the 2nd of the 2nd. And there were also administrative buildings that had been flattened already by artillery fire, with imminent new strikes about to come in as the quadcopter recon drones and the orbiting WZ-7 now within this area, spotting all the activity on the ground as trainees and even training personnel from the 2nd of the 6th Air Defense Artillery Regiment, the training schoolhouse battalion of the Air Defense Forces, were running throughout this area. This area was comprised of barracks and also command buildings that were company level and battalion level, as those were command and control centers considered by the Chinese and Russians as such, and they were to be destroyed by tactical ballistic missiles such as this incoming DF-15B, as well as cruise missile strikes hitting these here. These are parking lots for POVs, or personally operated vehicles, meaning that these were just regular cars, trucks, SUVs operated by different soldiers that worked on the installation, and up here as well. And this was a sort of parade field area outside of these barracks, and which were essentially battery level buildings, or company level, which a battery is just a company sized element, but for artillery or air defense artillery, these were battery level barracks and command buildings, as the battery captains had their offices in these buildings, and they were struck mercilessly by tactical ballistic missile and cruise missile strikes. And the forces on the ground were now being intercepted by enormous artillery fire, as indicated by all these artillery fire markers of imminent artillery strikes coming in. As this fairly large grouping of trainees that were training on the different howitzers in this motor pool were fleeing the motor pool area, they were now being struck by artillery strikes from howitzer shells of the 155 variety, fired from the 181st Combined Arms Brigade's 1 Artillery Battalion of their self-propelled PLZ 05 howitzers. As you can see, the arrow in which all these dismounts are running is surrounded by red, meaning they were completely wiped out by the artillery strikes, as well as CH-901As. And although the CH-901As being used were armed with heat warheads, they could still eliminate dismounted personnel. And this one hit this M109A6 Paladin right here. There were more coming in that ended up hitting these forces on the ground as they were spotted running, because by that time this missile came in and hit at the same time as the CH-901As hit. So this tactical ballistic missile strike from a DF-15B completely leveled these two buildings and destroyed these guns on the outer edges, because they were stuck here after this one got hit in the middle of the street. They were temporarily stuck here and were trying to go around it as the CH-901A hit this one, but it was too late, because then the incoming tactical ballistic missile leveled these two buildings. And the troops were already eliminated by these CH-901As, as all these things were occurring at relatively the same time. That's something that needs to be understood, as at the opening of these smaller map segments of the larger battles show, wherever units, including specific vehicles, aircraft, dismounts, missiles are shown, is where they are at the opening of the map. Although, of course, when this map continues, these things are already unfolding, such as all of these vehicles surrounded by blue, because as they were reaching this point here, this aircraft had already come down, this Su-34, and strafed the whole column and dropped 4 FAB 500s, which were essentially 1,000-pound munitions, on this whole area, in addition to these CH-901As hitting these groups of running forces here, which were running in all directions. You have to understand that it was a very frantic, panicked situation with the airstrikes, missile strikes, loitering munition strikes, attack helicopter fire, tank gun fire, because these tank guns had a fairly long range of over 3 miles, as again, these 125 millimeter main guns on these main battle tanks, these Type 99As, had a fairly long range to them. And this area here was only this was a 2 by 1 mile map. 1 mile north-south, 2 miles east to west. This is a small segment of the much larger battle occurring in this area. On the map, the larger battle map, the entire area where this fighting is going on is being surrounded on all sides, as these motor pool areas and inner training ranges here are being surrounded on all sides by the attacking 2 battalions, just like they surrounded these air defense elements. They surrounded this whole area as the mechanized infantry went this way and the armored forces went this way upon having come up and moved in from the southwest to the northeast to surround and encapsulate the forces of the 2nd of the 2nd in the area and some of the 1st of the 30th in the area, with its headquarters of headquarters battery later trying to retreat up here. These forces, as the Armored Battalion was moving in to surround this even larger areas, they were more moving in off the map to the north and south, with the Mechanized Infantry Battalion having moved in from the east, coming in from around the east to the north. They were encapsulating this large area now being struck by various tactical cruise missiles and CH-901A loitering munitions and heavy strategic air raids conducted by these 2 heavy H-6K strategic bomber aircraft, which overflew this large area and simply saturated whole motor pools, in addition to this entire firing battery of the 1st of the 30th, with this one being put together on an ad hoc basis from elements of the Alpha battery of the 2nd of the 2nd, in addition to trainees, again, filling positions that other personnel which had fled and discipline broke down and weren't able to fill because they were out here also getting struck by artillery fire, CH-901A loitering munitions fire, and airstrikes. It's very important to understand that in a situation like this, discipline will 100% break down. You will have troops that do everything in their ability to fight back, and then you will have others that don't know what to do and are panicked because there's no communications and nobody giving orders. That's very vital to understand in these situations. Some take initiative while others do not, essentially. When there's no communications, when everything breaks down under fire, different troops will respond in different ways. As the anti-satellite strikes, cyber strikes, and the local electronic warfare assets ensured there was no communication, therefore, the organization was put together on an ad hoc basis and only at the most local of levels, like what happened with these vehicles here, which were being struck by AKD-10 laser-guided anti-tank missiles being fired at these self-propelled guns. Their field artillery supply vehicles, or FASVs, in addition to the FTC vehicles, and the rest being leveled as these strategic bomber aircraft continued their flight over this area and just continually leveled everything from where they dropped their first loads all the way up, as they could drop their airdropped ordnance for miles, literally, like 2 to 3 miles worth of dropped ordnance. That simply saturated all these motor pools with whatever vehicles still remained in them, including these 2 Paladins, these 2 FASVs. There were 2 more Paladins here, 2 FASVs, 2 Paladins. They were completely destroyed along with these trucks. These vehicles were usually used for training new recruits, as well as for even working together on training operations with visiting units, but they were being completely wiped out. And also those vehicles that were used by the 1st of the 30th, such as these here, one of its 2 firing batteries being completely wiped out as well. This was its other firing battery, and that was wiped out. And the 2nd of the 2nd used these training vehicles again to one of its remaining members of its alpha battery, using them to meet the threat head on in an ad hoc manner, as their towed howitzers and trucks and everything else are being completely wiped out by the tactical ballistic missile and artillery strikes hitting this area hard. Down here in this area, these 2 Su-34s, as this one finished off this column of the other firing battery, this one was hitting these buildings here with their 4 airdropped FAB 500s, or their 1,000 pound munitions, 500 as in 500 kilograms. And these CH-901As were hitting these groups of troops here, while the airstrikes leveled this building in addition to the cruise missiles, these being Club Ks, as these buildings are surrounded by blue here, 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 and here. They're being hit by the airstrikes and the cruise missiles simultaneously. These could be either Club Ks or they could be YJ-18Cs. And the tactical ballistic missile coming in and destroying these 2 buildings here, as well as finishing off this huge building here, while the airstrikes were going to hit it anyway. As again, in previous videos, multiple platforms could hit the same targets, as firepower was concentrated very tightly in certain areas, ensuring total destruction of the American forces on the ground. As the heavy strategic bomber aircraft were overflying this area right here, totally saturating it, as well as these forces up here, these attack helicopters, for the time being, shifted their positions and flew around this one, of this whole company of attack helicopters in this area, flew around to this area to operate with the rest of their company up here, consisting of 8 total attack helicopters. Meanwhile, the armored company, just one company, spread out throughout this area, of its 20 total tanks of the Type 99A variety, as well as its headquarters platoon sitting further back, were firing their 125 millimeter tank shells, as well as their anti-tank guided missiles able to be fired from their 125 millimeter main guns, and were likewise hitting various targets, with many of their shells overflying even this area to hit targets further away, as again they had an over 3-mile range for their main tank guns. Some, though, did fire into this area at the same time as these heavy strategic bomber aircraft leveled them. As this encapsulated green arrow indicates, the entire column here was completely destroyed. These vehicles were already destroyed first because, as being on the outer fringes of the blast radiuses, were simply wiping these vehicles out, and in addition to tank shells hitting some of them as well, such as these here, this one here, while this MRAP's on the blast radius, and this one too getting destroyed. So are these vehicles. These were destroyed by the missile impacts, but were about to get destroyed by the airstrikes or the air raid as well. The missile and air raids on this area, including the strafing by their nose cannons, were wiping out all of these troops that were running throughout the area frantically, as discipline again had broken down. And these buildings were already hit by artillery earlier, but were being hit again to intercept these fleeing troops from this motor pool. Artillery was striking up here already at the opening of the map. And these AKD-10 anti-tank laser-guided missiles were hitting these vehicles fired by these Z-10 attack helicopters in conjunction with their 25 millimeter Gatling guns, their chain guns, tearing up these vehicles, simply shredding them to pieces in conjunction with all of the air-fired, laser-guided AKD-10 anti-tank missiles. This whole column was completely ripped up by the time it reached this point right here. It was completely being shredded to pieces. And to further add destruction to the area, these bombers continuing to fly and drop their ordnance simply hit the already smoking hulks of metal that were once their vehicles, as they've been completely blasted by these anti-tank guided missiles, laser guided, as well as the chain gun fire, as well as tank shell fire, and more. Combat in this area was savage, very destructive. Dozens of vehicles were lost just from the air strikes alone and the missile strikes. But more were lost as well due to the ground-fired units of the armor and the mechanized infantry operating to the east and north, with the armor battalion also operating to the west, north, and slightly south, comprising a total circle around this much larger area of the installation so that it could be cut off and completely blasted to oblivion by these various strike methods. Much of the fire, again, was ISR directed, drone directed, as the quadcopter recon drones of the ground-based forces scanned the area and relayed targeting data back to the combat data links processed by AI to continually update on the fluid battlefield conditions as they changed, including to the air assets to strike, as well as the CH-901A loitering munitions being set on AI targeting mode themselves. As cruise missiles hit pre-selected targets like key buildings, as well as the tactical ballistic missiles firing at certain pre-designated targets as well, including the motor pools and their buildings and vehicles, as well as command buildings, barracks buildings. The fighting, again, in this area was extremely savage, with many vehicles looking like this flaming, burning hulk of metal, of twisted metal that was an MRAP, as the same was happening to M109A6 Paladins, Fast Vs, LMTV trucks, field trucks, M88 armored recovery vehicles, the high-top M113 FDC vehicles, and more. Not to mention the towed howitzers being completely obliterated, the M119A3s of the two different firing batteries that operated them of the 2nd of the 2nd Field Artillery Battalion, the Alpha and Bravo batteries of that battalion operating the M119A3s, 105mm howitzers, most of which being destroyed by the opening missile and artillery barrages, with the personnel from those two firing batteries, again on a very ad hoc basis, mounting up, even with some trainees, once again, in the self-propelled guns also utilized for training purposes, and trying to drive them out to meet the threat. As again, these forces were already conducting training and did have access to live ammunition, and before the invasion even started, it needs to be understood that these forces, along with trainees, were preparing to go out to firing ranges anyhow and conduct live fire training. And we're doing preliminary pre-maintenance services and checks on their vehicles, and the cadre were ensuring that certain information and briefings were gone over with the trainees right before the initial opening strikes began, leading to the destruction of all of these forces, including all the troops and trainees, at the hands of the combined armor, mechanized infantry, helicopter, missile forces, and air power, even loitering munitions, such as the CH-901As, utilized in this very destructive battle that in its totality was over in a manner of 15 total minutes. That's how fast all of it unfolded. As this was already occurring, once again, the first companies were being flown in by the transport helicopters of the two transport helicopter battalions belonging to the 77th Group Army's 77th Aviation Brigade, flying them in first to Henry Army Airfield, the first two battalions, before returning, picking up the other two to bring them in to take control over the Lawton Fort Sill Regional Airport inside of Lawton City. Highest priority being the Henry Army Airfield, which that was the reasoning behind airlifting in the air assault mission conducted by these two Special Operations Battalions to be conducted first before the other last two battalions to be airlifted in would be dropped off at the Lawton Fort Sill Regional Airport. All in all, by this point, it was going on 3 a.m. and the fighting at 3 a.m. would still be of an intense nature, although by this time, once again, much of the 75th Field Artillery Brigade had been completely annihilated by this point, with very small groupings attempting very tiny localized counterattacks, all of which ending in failure, as they were simply no match for the better organized, better equipped, better trained, and then with far more adequate ISR assets, artificial intelligence, and communications. The 77th Combat Engineering Brigade completely was wiping the floor, as the saying went, with these forces. With air support from the Russian VVS and their own, even their own fighter squadron of J-11s, these very tiny counterattacks were essentially just pinpricks in the grand scheme of things, although the 1st Armored Division's visiting Divisional Artillery Brigade still had coherent, somewhat cohesive forces remaining that would be fought by the Combat Engineer Battalion that had been initially tasked with its first objective being to seize the southwest corner airfield and would get into a battle next with them, as their 5 combat companies of that battalion had already moved up as the fighting was unfolding with the 3rd of the 13th at the airfield area itself, with all of its pre-prepared firing positions for the M270 MLRS systems, in addition to the interlocking fortifications of foxholes and machine gun sandbag emplacements, which had interlocking fields of fire. This had already by then been captured, leaving the headquarters company of this battalion holding the airfield with 2 of the capturing initial companies of combat troops of the Engineer Battalion that seized the airfield, providing a security perimeter around it, while the other 5 companies proceeded to engage the 4th of the 3rd Field Artillery Battalion here, and the 4th of the 60th SHORAD, or Short Range Air Defense Artillery Battalion, which had much shorter range systems built around these Stinger missiles, which could not reach anywhere near the altitude as these heavy strategic bombers were flying, or even typically the altitude of the Su-35s and J-11s, and could only hit fixed-wing aircraft if they were flying at low altitudes, and thus were not nearly as much of a threat for the air power as was the Patriot battalions, which had a much higher reach in terms of altitude as well as a much longer range than did these SHORAD systems, these SHORAD IMs, which were striker-based systems. In the next video of this hypothetical documentary series, the battle unfolding to the north of the southwest corner airfield carried out by elements of this Combat Engineer Battalion is next, along with their generous air support received by the heavy strategic bomber aircraft as well as the Su-35 strike aircraft. So all of this was unfolding. Battles were even raging outside of the installation, with tiny bands of armed civilians attempting to do whatever they could to resist. While now on the installation, much of the fighting shifted to the main post itself, which would be around the Henry Army Airfield, along with this northwest corner now wrapping up, and of course the small bands of troops that are still operating and trying to regroup and carry out counterattacks in this area in the northeast, as well as, of course, these now cut off increasingly and isolated elements of the 1st Armored Division's Divisional Artillery Brigade. The Battle of Lawton, Fort Sill continues next.